Hey, what's going on, everyone? It's Sean from All Things EV, and I've got Jordan from the Limiting Factor YouTube channel on again, and we're going to rap about batteries, costs, cost per kilowatt hour. Welcome back to the show, Jordan.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited, and thanks for taking some time to jump on again. It's always a good conversation when we get together, I think, and hopefully people who are watching this today really enjoy our chat. So one of the things that prompted me to reach out to you is I've been following this chatter over the last several months about rising cost of raw materials for batteries. And there's one article in particular that really kind of solidified this. It just gave me a really nice visual, and it's a CNBC article, which I sent over recently to you, and it talks about the cost of raw materials for electric vehicles. And it's not specific to Tesla, but I just thought it was a nice visual for people to take a look at. The article says that the cost of raw materials for electric vehicles is up 144% from March of 2020 to May of 2022. So a little over 2 years, it's gone up 144%. And it's just a lot of money. And so it prompted me to reach out to you to have this discussion about what Tesla is doing specifically, and I guess more broadly, what other automakers are doing to tackle the rising cost of raw materials, which of course downflows into total cost of vehicle. So because you spent a lot of time dissecting Tesla's Battery Day, I think I want to start there. And Battery Day took place in September of 2020, so pretty much 2 years ago from the day that we're recording this video. They talked about 5 ways to tackle reducing the cost per kilowatt hour. 1 is cell design, 2 cell factory, 3 anode materials, 4 cathode materials, and 5 cell vehicle production. You spent a lot of time dissecting this entire presentation. How does Tesla take what's happening in the market today with increasing raw materials costs and try to tackle that as well as make sure that they're accomplishing what they announced 2 years ago?
Yeah, so there's 2 sides to that. First is their external battery cell and like raw material supply. And the second is what they're actually doing in-house. So in terms of that percentage increase that was quoted in that article, I don't think Tesla's paying that much extra for the materials they get because they're locked into long-term contracts. I didn't look in detail into that article, but I'm assuming they're talking about open market prices, which Tesla, they're not buying on the open market, so they're not subject to swings that are as wild. Now, in terms of what was unveiled at Battery Day and Tesla's longer-term plan to bring cell manufacturing in-house, that's going to do a lot to help them control costs in a number of ways. A lot of people are focused on the manufacturing side of cells because they think that's the best way to reduce the cost of battery cells. But the manufacturing process itself only makes up about 25% of the cost of the battery cell. And the other, 75%, that's actually raw materials. And that's why you notice Tesla at Battery Day talking about moving upstream into refining material and potentially at some point into mining, because that's where one of the biggest opportunities is.
Elon once mentioned that Tesla may get into the mining business. So is what you're saying, does it correlate with Tesla getting into the mining business? Is it should we take him at his word that they are literally getting into the mining business and pulling the raw materials from out of the ground, or does it mean something else in that they're going to be doing partnerships with mining companies?
I think they will if they have to. I think actually buying a miner or getting into mining themselves is the last option. I think part of what they're doing there is actually a strategy to maybe, the fact that Tesla's saying that they're willing to get into mining if they have to, I think is a signal to the market that says, hey, we're really serious. You guys aren't giving us the raw materials we need. And if you don't do it, we're going to do it. And you're going to miss out on those profits, which is something Elon's kind of indicated at the past couple of earnings calls, talking about the software-like margins that some of these companies are getting.
Yeah, it's from my understanding, it's an incredibly cost-intensive endeavor to not only do the due diligence and research for a potential mine, but also to get the permits is a long process. So to me, I think I would agree with you in that Tesla would rather have other companies do it. They'd rather partner together with other companies to do it because it is a very, very particular expertise that requires a lot of cash. Would you agree?
Yes, and it's very risky because it's scaling. People assume that scaling mining is like scaling manufacturing, and it's just not. Because manufacturing, they have there's quality control of the materials that they have coming into those factories. It's very standardized what goes into them. Whereas a mine, every different mine that you start has a slightly different flow sheet because there's slightly different characteristics to the material that you're mining. And even if you mine it one depth and then you mine it a little bit lower depth, you're going to have a material that's potentially slightly different. So you have to accommodate for that. And as you said, the permitting process, for instance, in the U.S. is about 10 years, whereas in some other places it's about 2 years. So you have to take into account the regulations as well. And there's a lot of environmental concerns wrapped up in mining. And rightly so. And if Tesla can keep that one step removed from themselves, it makes their life from a public relations perspective a lot easier. And if Tesla did get into mining, that would be Tesla has so many good engineers, and there's so many things that Tesla wants to do. If there's something they can outsource, they will, because that frees up their talent and their resources to do other things like scaling their factories.
50% growth year over year is pretty aggressive. That means that they're going to need a lot of raw materials. They're going to need to partner together with almost everyone, right? And if I'm referring to I'm taking a look at production, end of year production for 2022, and it looks like Troy Tesla from Twitter is projecting 1.38 million vehicles, and at a 50% growth year over year. That's a lot of raw materials. How does Tesla protect themselves in terms of fluctuating costs? I mean, you mentioned long-term contracts, so that may not affect them today because of those long-term contracts, but if costs continue to rise, they'll likely need to renegotiate. So it's making those long-term contracts, getting the right prices for those, but other automakers are also talking about contracts, and so how does Tesla protect themselves to make sure that they're the ones getting the best deal?
I think you rightly point out that, okay, if Tesla's costs rise for these vehicles, well, they're going to be in the same boat as everybody else, but Tesla's the 800-pound gorilla, and they have more, they have deeper pockets and bigger profit margins. So they have Tesla can actually pay more for these materials than anybody else, while at the same time, Tesla's vehicle manufacturing processes are better than anybody else. So Tesla has the most wiggle room, and I would think if raw material prices increase, and it increases across the board, it actually puts Tesla in a better position, because those higher raw material prices for a manufacturer that's not as efficient, it might put them out of business and allow Tesla to sweep the board and take the market. So in terms of raw material prices, I don't see it being a problem for Tesla, because they can always raise their prices. They've shown that they're able to do that, and they have a large margin that they can play with.
Tesla has proven themselves that they're not afraid to jump into something if they see cost benefit, production benefit. And so I think that's why we've seen them try to bring a lot of things in-house, cell manufacturing being one of those. Elon has talked about how ideally he wants everything from cell production to vehicle production and everything in between to be in one place. Shanghai is a really good example of that. Giga Texas is a really good example of that. That seems like the model that Tesla is going with from this point forward. There's rumors that, well, Elon said in the last shareholder meeting that they're going to likely announce the next Gigafactory. There's a lot of chatter about where that's going to be. Does cost of raw materials have anything to do with where that next location is? Because I hear a lot of people talking about Canada, and you know, Canada seems to make sense, but there could be some other places that might make sense as well. I've heard people talk about Australia, Indonesia. What makes sense to you?
So going back to one of the first questions you asked was about controlling costs. And one thing that slipped my mind is just the fact that Tesla is bringing battery cell manufacturing in-house. At the cell level, the tariffs and shipping and margin that other cell manufacturers charge, that's about 20% of the cell cost. So simply by bringing manufacturing in-house, and if Tesla did nothing different than any other cell manufacturer and localized, it would automatically save them about 20% on those battery cells. And to your point, well, does that influence where they put a gigafactory? Yes, and that's why Tesla's building out locations on each continent. But I don't know within that continent or that country how much of a difference it makes at this point. I think in the long term they will want, you know, to be as localized as possible and put production as close to the customer as possible. But at this point, I think they just the fact that they're getting vehicle production in the country and they don't have to ship those vehicles around the world makes a huge difference for Tesla. In terms of which country that I think they're going to build this factory in, I think the Canada guess is about as good a guess as any. Canada and China would be my first two guesses because China has such a huge population. And I have a feeling they're starting to get at the limits of what the Shanghai factory can do. So China makes sense to me. And the raw material supply chain is in place there. It's very localized there. And then in terms of Canada, why that makes sense to me is because Tesla has a huge amount of demand in the US, and that's not completely tapped out yet. And Tesla seems to build their factories in areas where there's a lot of talent. And then on top of that, you have the vertical integration and the connections and the localization, and then the connections Tesla has in Canada. I think part of Tesla's automation arm for battery manufacturing is in Canada, and of course they have connections to Jeff Dahn's research group. And so if they build around, you know, say the Toronto area, like somebody suggested, that would make sense to me. I don't think they're going to build a factory out in the middle of nowhere. I think it's going to be close to a large population center with a lot of talent to pull from. And I think they might have. Part of what helped teach them that lesson was the fact they built Giga Nevada in the middle of the desert, and then they've had issues resourcing and staffing that facility because it's just out in the middle of nowhere.
You're exactly right. It is in the middle of nowhere. Just to play devil's advocate here, Tesla's got a factory in Fremont. They've got a factory in Reno. They've got a factory in Austin. And a lot of people forget that they have a factory in Buffalo, New York as well, producing solar cells. So their presence in the U.S. their presence in North America is very strong. So do they really need another factory in North America? Is there that much benefit, do you think, by having one in Canada as well?
It's a really good point. I can only cite the reasons that I mentioned earlier, and then on top of that, like the transport and logistics of that area is really good, which is why there was originally vehicle manufacturing built around Detroit, because it's a good hub with the lakes, rivers, etc., and access to a huge population base. Like for instance, I live in Ohio, and I'm maybe about a 5 to 10 hour drive from, more like a 10-hour drive to Toronto, I think. So One reason companies come here to Ohio is because there's such a good road network in this area and navigable rivers, bodies of water, etc. There's just a good logistics network to get raw materials and things in and out. And we're close to, I think people usually say we're close to like, the majority of the U.S. population is within 500 miles of Ohio. So it's a good position logistically. And then on top of that, I'll be interested to see how willing buyers in Europe are to buy Teslas over locally made vehicles. And that's for two reasons. First, it seems like Europeans tend to more typically buy European cars. The other reason is that Europe, their EV industry is growing quite rapidly, and they're putting a lot of resources into it. So I think there's going to be not competition, so to speak, but there's going to be EVs available in Europe, and people in Europe might have a preference for those vehicles.
Yeah, I would probably eliminate Europe as a potential consideration. It seems like Giga Berlin should be able to service all of Europe, even right-hand drive Europe. China makes a lot of sense because of the sheer market, and there's no shortage of raw materials supply chain. So I think that they've got that very established, and that would make sense. Canada seems to make a lot of sense in terms of proximity to raw materials. I recently watched a video on the Rockstock channel, which is done by RK Equities. They were surmising that Canada is the logical place for them to announce a gigafactory because of the sheer companies, mining companies, raw material companies that are actually in Canada. So I think for that reason alone, that would probably be the strongest indicator to me, in my opinion, that Tesla would announce a gigafactory in Canada to get access to those. And then, I don't remember if we've talked about this as a reason why Tesla wants to localize raw materials, but for national security purposes, it seems like the U.S. is very keen lately on accelerating permits and encouraging trade with friends of the U.S. for raw materials. Do you know much about that?
That's not something I know a whole lot about, but it's definitely in the strategic interest of the U.S. to either localize or what they're calling lately friend source, buy from countries that are friendly to the U.S., which China, of course, isn't on that list. So by building a factory in the U.S., it doesn't solve that. Or building a factory in Canada, I don't think it solves that problem. But that's more to do with the raw material supply chain. But it does, when that factory gets up and running, it makes it cheaper to produce vehicles out of that factory. So yeah, there's where they build the vehicle factories, and then where, of course, they build the raw material supply chain. So one thing that it might do if they build a factory in Canada is it might strengthen the relationship with Canada in terms of raw materials, etc. Because then Canada has more of a dog in the fight, so to speak. It's like, all right, we have this massive factory producing 2 million vehicles a year that's bringing in billions and billions of dollars into the economy. Then it starts giving you some political influence and leverage when you have things like that show up. And sort of something that's along the lines of this, because there's, of course, other countries besides China, Europe, and Canada that we could build one of these gigafactories. There's like Indonesia and Australia. If you want to talk about those, we can get into those a little bit, because people watching this video, those might come across their mind. So Indonesia, they have nickel mines in Indonesia, massive amounts of nickel, and that's where the majority of our future nickel is going to come from, is Indonesia. So Indonesia, they want to build they want more manufacturing jobs in Indonesia. They want to create more value-added products there rather than just mining the raw materials and shipping them off to another country. They want a foot in the game in battery cell manufacturing. And I think that, at a minimum, I think it makes sense for Tesla to build some sort of battery cell manufacturing in Indonesia that would cut out a lot of the movement of raw materials and help vertically integrate in one location. In terms of vehicles, I don't know if that's the best place to build a vehicle manufacturing facility for the reasons that I mentioned before, which is all the talent that it requires. And I don't know how industrialized Indonesia is and how well they'd be able to support one of these cutting edge facilities that Tesla's building. In terms of Australia, now one good thing about Indonesia, one last note on that, it's very central. And Indonesia has lots of access to water. I don't know how many deep water ports they have for shipping, but it's a series of islands, so I don't know whether that works out positively or negatively in terms of logistics. In terms of Australia, I used to live down that way. It's so far from everything that things tend to be more expensive down on that end of the world because of all the shipping and logistics costs, because it's so far away from the rest of the world. And I don't know, with Australia having like 60 million people and New Zealand having about 4 million people, that's not a very big population base to supply vehicles to. Whereas the US, we have 300 million people. So that's like 5 times the size of Australia. So we'd need 5 factories here for every 1 factory that we'd have in Indonesia. So that's just a few of the things I think of when I look at other countries. I don't know if I'm right or not, but that's what crosses my mind.
Yeah, I'm not talking with deep knowledge of Indonesia, but their sourcing, their ethical sourcing, I think may need some work. So I think Tesla's very aware of where they get their raw materials from. They do an annual report each year on the ethics of their raw materials. They want to make sure they're getting them from ethically sourced places. So I think there may be some challenges there with that.
I think it's a really good point, and I think the way Tesla is getting around that is they're getting deeply involved with these mines, and they're becoming a consultant in the mines, and they're trying to help improve the environmental standards at those mines, which is something they mentioned in their sustainability report, and it's something we've seen with their Goro mine in New Caledonia, where they've been brought on as a consultant to try to improve the situation there. And I'd be interested to see, a lot of these facilities are CO2 intensive because they're energy intensive. Tesla can help out with that, maybe give them some advice on how they can make those mines cleaner by switching to solar batteries, or even use Tesla solar and batteries. So yeah, the environmental piece is really important.
I mean, maybe Tesla needs to come out with an all electric earth mover, a battery powered earth mover.
That would be cool. Yeah.
We've talked about pulling new materials out of the ground, which is expensive. One thing that a lot of people overlook is this recycling of existing materials in battery cells. So packs reach the end of their life. I hear conspiracy theorists say that those battery packs go into landfills, but that's not true. And I think every major automaker who's committing to electric vehicles is also committing to the recycling of those packs, whether by doing it themselves, like Tesla has stated recently, or by sending them to third parties to get recycled. Let's talk about that, because I think that there's a lot of promise in recycling and in reducing the cost per kilowatt hour.
Yeah, this is a big topic, and it's something I'm getting more and more excited about now that I'm seeing J.B. Straubel of Redwood Materials, who he's one of the co-founders of Tesla for the, I'm assuming everybody who's watching this video probably already knows that, but what he's doing with recycling down in Nevada is interesting, because it's not just about recycling. The more he talks about it, the more I see his master plan coming into mind, which is, if you recycle batteries, you're going to be able to get your raw materials more cheaply, because it's easier to get those chemicals out of a battery cell than it is to get them. Typically, when you mine an ore, it's maybe 1% of the material you're looking for, and the rest is waste. And it's typically a very toxic, energy-intensive process to just get that 1% out. Whereas batteries, you're looking at, I don't know what percentage it is, because there's so many different metals in it, but you're looking at, I'm guessing, at least 2/3 of it can be reused. There's some plastic and things like that you wouldn't be able to reuse, but for the most part, you're looking at a highly concentrated ore. And if you get your process down, you're going to get those materials cheaply. And then what they want to do next is they want to start building cathode, or they're starting to build cathode manufacturing, as well as like copper foil manufacturing. So they're going to have this full vertical integration on top of getting the raw materials cheaply. So it's going to provide this cheap supply of battery materials here in North America. Now that's going to ramp slowly. I think they're planning for like 100 gigawatt hours by 2025 and 300 gigawatt hours by 2030.
Tesla right now is at how much cell production? 100 gigawatt hours today seems to stick in my mind. Do you recall what they're at now for cell production?
Oh, they're probably at around, like in terms of the cell supply that they're getting from other suppliers, it's around 100 gigawatt hours, I would say, because if they're at a run rate of like 1.5 million per year currently, because they want to get to a run rate of like 2 million by the end of the year, let's say an average pack size of 66 kilowatt hours, that puts you at about 100 gigawatt hours. So that's enough to support Tesla's current capacity, and Redwood wants to have that online by 2025. So if we pan back, the amount of capacity that Redwood wants to build by 2025 will cover about 10% of the battery materials market. And by 2030, more like maybe 20% of the battery materials market. So it's a long play, and it will make a big difference over the next few years. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of vehicles by 2025.
Yeah, it really does seem like recycling will have a huge part in driving down costs. It just has to the recycling process has to mature a little bit, but it really does seem like there's some promise.
Oh yeah, and especially in the long term. One thing, say if we're able to maintain good relations with China, and we import all these raw materials from China, eventually the material supply chain from China isn't going to matter anymore once we get into the 2030s, late 2030s, because we're going to have all the nickel we need for our vehicles and all the raw materials that we need for our vehicles. And if we keep recycling that, eventually it's all going to be locally sourced, so long as those recycling facilities are built in the U.S. So that's a longer term play, and it's not something that we can rely on in the immediate future. But but besides that, the long term geopolitics of it is going to reduce costs quite a bit, and it's going to those raw materials are going to get more pure. It's like if you run something through a filtration process. That's essentially what miners are doing. They're taking 99% ore and they're filtering out everything else to get that 1%. Now, after it gets into a battery cell and you recycle it, it becomes more and more pure each time that you recycle it. So, and those materials are going to be lower cost. I don't expect that to make a big dent or an impact in the next, 5 to 10 years. But what it will allow is U.S. companies to be more competitive, the more recycling capacity that we have here. Tesla's going to have their full vertical integration, and they're going to have, an advantage in cost. Whereas these other automakers that are behind, they may be able to buy these materials cheaper from Redwood. Either that or Redwood's going to be making more of a profit.
And it's also important to recognize that there are a lot of batteries out there in computers and electronic cell phones and so on, but there's a significantly greater amount of batteries in electric vehicles, and there's not as many vehicles on the road. So I think Elon said in the last shareholders meeting that they're recycling 20 packs a month. That's just because the battery packs are still in their prime of their life, so they haven't yet reached the end of their life, and therefore don't need to be recycled yet. But that's going to grow, and the need to recycle battery packs from vehicles will grow as well. So I'm sure that's factored in. What are the chances that Redwood also gets into cell production? They've talked about anode and cathode production, but what if they just get into the entire process of cell making?
I think it's potentially the other shoe to drop. And this is interesting because they're working the opposite direction Tesla is. Because what Tesla's done is they started with vehicle manufacturing, and they're continually building these further shells out to go more upstream into the supply chain. They're focusing on the area of competence, and they moved into the thing that's most adjacent to that area of competence. Now, Redwood, they've started with their competence as recycling, which is, basically we can think about it as mining battery cells. So they're moving downstream. They're going to from those raw materials into building the cathode and anode materials, and from there they could move on to cell manufacturing. So I see it as a good possibility, and I wouldn't be surprised if JB Straubel mentions something about that in the next few years. They have a lot on their plate. They have a lot of plans, but they do have plans up until 2025, 2030. We'll see how it goes. I think they need to digest what they're working on now, and we'll probably hear something.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, if he wanted more capital, if he wanted more investment, I think that this would be a really interesting way to get that investment, is to say that they're getting into cell production.
I just had an exciting idea. Because Tesla indicated at their last earnings call that they're willing to share their dry battery electrode technology and their cell production manufacturing technology with other parties. Now, I've always said that, well, Tesla's going to be very careful who they share that technology with, because it takes a lot of their time and resources to share this information. They have to give. There's information they need to share, engineering know-how, there's trade secrets, etc., things like that. So they have to be careful who they partner with. But Redwood Materials, I mean, there's a good relationship there between JB Straubel and Elon. I'd be interested to see if Tesla would be willing to share their cell manufacturing technology with Redwood.
I've always wondered why JB decided to start his own thing versus do that at Tesla. It would seem like Tesla would have more capital to be able to really explore that interest if that was the case, and if he was really driven to do that. So do you really think that Tesla and Redwood are working as closely together as your statement would imply?
We do know that Redwood was recycling materials that were coming out of Giga, Nevada. And Elon's I think he recently appeared on stage with JB Straubel. So my understanding of, the rumors were that there was some conflict between JB and Elon, and I have no reason to doubt whether true, but you can be in conflict with somebody who's a good friend and still work with them and share a vision about the direction things should head. And so I don't think there's any real bad blood between Elon and JB if they're willing to show up on stage together and their companies are working together. So now I don't know how tight that relationship is, but the idea, your idea that Redwood could get into cell manufacturing, to me, that would make the most sense for them to get that technology for Tesla and not use the conventional processes, because they're a lot more dirty. They waste more energy. It's just Tesla's system, if they get it up and running, is going to be the most advanced cell manufacturing system in the world. And with that relationship in place, that would be a shoo-in from my perspective.
Yeah. We haven't yet talked about lithium clay. Do you want to mention any of that, because that is sort of we haven't heard a lot about that since they talked about that in September of 2020. I mean, that seems like a possibility, but it seems like a really immature idea, at least when they talked about it, and especially since we haven't heard much about it, but could also be a way to drive down cost per kilowatt hour.
My main concern actually with that wouldn't be the technology itself, because I've looked into the patents. I did a video on it, and it's really fascinating. If they carried out what's in the patent, there's some really cool ideas in there. The salt plus clay process. For me, it's more about the permitting and the fact that you'd have to deal with all these thousands and thousands of tons of clay just to extract out a little bit of lithium. The economics might be difficult, the environmental aspect of it might be difficult, but Drew Baglino recently mentioned so one more note on the lithium clay. If we do see it, I don't expect to see it for another several years, because we haven't heard anything about Tesla purchasing a mine, or purchasing land, or filing for permits. And these would be the leading indicators for us to let us know how serious Tesla is with that and how far along they are. Now, Drew Baglino, recently at a Stanford Energy talk, he was talking about oil field brines. Now, to me, that makes more sense because oil field brines, my understanding is they're spent oil wells that are filled with like a salty solution, and that salty solution contains lithium. And then all you'd have to do, now it would be in practice very difficult, but conceptually it's straightforward. You pump that oil field brine through a direct lithium extraction process that specifically targets and pulls out the lithium. So it's a lot easier to pump fluid through a process than it is to work with thousands of tons of clay material. And on top of that, these oil field brines, I imagine it would be easier to permit them because A, it's in Canada and it only takes about 2 years to get permitted there. And B, you're already talking about a site that was a home to mining. So my assumption is that would make it easier. So yeah, for me, Tesla could get into lithium mining. And I say mining broadly because that would include those lithium brines. But as I said before, I think they're only going to get into that if they have to. But there's a few options there for them. We do know that Tesla has teams working on extracting specific materials from, like the recycling process. Recycling is actually very similar to mining because there's one material you need and it's mixed in with a whole bunch of other things. How do you extract the specific thing out that you need? So Tesla has teams that are devoted to working on things like this, and they would just have to apply that expertise to other areas. So yeah, they could do it, and they will do it if they have to. And I think I would prefer to see an oil field brine over clay because it just seems like it would be easier. But I don't know what Tesla has cooking.
Yeah, I mean, the more that I think about the recycling piece, the more promise it seems like it has. Because, I mean, you talk about the permitting process being extremely long. Even 2 years is long in Tesla's eyes. I mean, they're making changes and iterations on parts of their process on a daily basis and weekly basis. And so 2 years just seems like an eternity. The recycling piece means that they can circumvent any permitting processes likely. They just need their hands on the packs. Tesla is the largest producer of electric vehicles in the United States and a leader globally. It would seem like they would have the best advantage to get their hands on used packs that have reached the end of their life. So you skip the permitting process. I mean, I think that mining raw materials is certainly an end that they need to continue to push on, but the recycling piece seems like a huge opportunity here in the very near future because they just announced their 3 millionth car produced, right? So in 5-10 years, they're going to have access to a lot of battery packs, and recycling just seems like a really key and fundamental aspect that they have not talked a lot about that seems like huge promise.
Yeah, they haven't talked a lot about it on earnings calls and in other venues, but it is in their sustainability report, and their goal is to make a closed loop system for recycling those battery packs. And this is where Tesla has one advantage over Redwood materials for recycling. Now, Tesla has now confirmed that they are completely doing this in-house. They were shipping some, materials off to Redwood materials, but yeah, they have their own recycling process built in-house, and it'll just scale more and more as they have more of these packs coming through. And I like the idea that you were pointing out that not only is recycling cheaper, it doesn't come with all the PR risks. In fact, it's the polar opposite of the PR risks you have with a mine. Mining, you have all, like, A, the permitting issues, and B, all the public relations and perceptions issues because of the toxic side effects that you often see with mines, whereas recycling is the reverse. It's like, oh, no, we're taking something that would have been thrown away, and we're doing that in-house. So it's not just... it's actually a PR positive to get into recycling. Then there's there's less permitting, and then it's cheaper. So yeah, there's all those synergies going on there. One more benefit of Tesla's closed loop system is they're going to have a logistics network in place to get these packs, because they're going to have robo taxis returning from their fleet. They're going to have customers doing trade-ins, people who need their battery pack goes bad and they need that battery pack replaced. So Tesla has logistics in place to get all these battery packs. Whereas Redwood, I don't know how they do their logistics. If they have to pay to have that stuff shipped around the country, or the people who have these battery cells just drop them off. And then Redwood is dealing with a broad variety of battery cells and chemistries. Whereas Tesla, they're just going to be dealing with Tesla battery packs, and it'll make their recycling process easier because it's there won't be as much variance in the inputs.
Redwood will specialize in recycling, though. That's all that they do. So they should be extremely good at it. And Tesla will likely bring that in-house and get even more proficient at it. But Redwood's got no shortage of automotive partners. My assumption would be that traditional automotive is going to outsource recycling. They're not going to get into it. I could see some companies long down the line, like Rivian and Lucid, getting into recycling as well, if they choose to. But Redwood's not going to have any shortage of partners to be able to recycle packs. So that seems promising even on its own. But we could very well see the maturation of recycling here very, very soon. I kind of have this instinct that we're going to hear a little bit more about recycling, whether it be Tesla or anyone else, because it just seems like a fundamental piece of driving down cost. It just seems like a very natural fit to drive down cost.
Oh yeah, it's as I was saying earlier, it solves so many problems at once, and it actually solves future problems and geopolitical problems as well when we do the recycling here. I don't know how cheap that recycling can get right now. I think JB Straubel said they're about breaking even on recycling, but they're at such a small scale at the moment. But when they hit 100 gigawatt hours, 500 gigawatt hours of scale, then they start vertically integrating as well, producing cathode materials in-house and copper foils in-house, and then potentially if they get into cell manufacturing, oh boy, it's going to have a big impact on cost in the long term, and it'll have an increasing impact on cost. So it's something I expect to hear about in Tesla's Master Plan Part 3. Raw materials from mining and then recycling as well. They're both just as important.
Let's timestamp this conversation, and we can come back and revisit it and see if our instincts were right here. I've got a feeling that we're going to hear some more. That's not based on any sort of back channel knowledge on my part, but it seems like a logical step, and I do think that. I do think we'll hear something about that. So I think that's a good note to wrap up on. Jordan, thank you so much for joining the channel again. It's always a good conversation. If people want to follow you and connect with you online, where can they do that?
My YouTube channel, The Limiting Factor on YouTube, and then on Twitter, it's @LimitingThe.
And you're now full-time YouTubing, so you've got a Patreon. If people like your content and people want to support you there to allow you to do this, continue to do this full-time, right?
I have a Patreon as well. I forget what the specific link is, but if you look up The Limiting Factor, you'll find me.
Awesome. All right, Jordan. Well, thanks again, and hope to have you on very soon.